folks, we're going to be knocking another project off the list today, and this time it's a 1949 Bolens Handi-Ho Model 10A. So these are pretty cool units. I never saw one until this one came up for sale at the end of last year, and I actually bought this when I bought the Planet Junior HT tractor that you guys saw the repair videos on. The same guy had both of these units, and I figured this would be a nice addition to the collection. So these were made, this is a first year model, it's a 1949, and I think they were made until the mid-50s or so. I can't find a whole lot of info on them, and luckily enough I was able to find some PDFs of manuals that guys had copied and uploaded to the internet, so it kind of gives me an idea on parts breakdowns and what was available for attachments. So I ended up getting the 24-inch sickle bar with this, the 22-inch reel mower, which we are going to be mounting to it, and then I also have the cultivator set up that mounts to the back of the rear counterweight right there. So it's a very simple unit. It has a single wheel drive in the back. Everything is driven by V-belts. There's a small aluminum gearbox with a jack shaft that chain drives down to the rear wheel. It has a Briggs & Stratton Model NS engine on it, suction style carburetor. Fuel tank is clean, luckily enough. So we're going to be doing a revamp on this thing and getting everything up and running and back up to par again. Alrighty, so the first thing I'm going to do is get this engine pulled off of here. That way we can get it up onto the bench and start digging into that. So we'll get this running first, and then we'll go through the frame and everything else and get that up to par. So it took me a little while to figure out what this leg is that's sticking out the side, and yesterday when I got this down here I figured out that it's actually the kickstand for this tractor when it doesn't have an attachment on the bottom to hold it up, because I saw the clip right over here for it, so I thought that was kind of cool that that was still on there and nobody had removed it yet. Alright, so the engine's been pulled off, and this thing does roll over, but it's a little bit stiff, and it kind of feels like the cylinder might be kind of dry, or there might be a little bit of rust in it, because when I got this, I picked this in the Planet Junior up in the rain, and this was sitting in the guy's front yard for who knows how long since he first got it, and there was no air cleaner or anything covering that intake, so I'm kind of surprised that the thing still rolls over. So what we're going to do is get this stripped down, that way we can see what the deal is with the engine. I'm going to get the fuel tank and the carburetor all pulled off, and we get the head pulled off of here as well and take a look underneath there and see what's going on. Alright, so there's the head of our engine, folks. It definitely has a lot of carbon underneath it, so most likely it was starting to burn oil over time. I'm sure this thing's got some use on it for a 1949. But aside from that, the cylinder on this thing looks nice. Granted, it is glazed, but it doesn't have any rust or anything like that. So the stickiness might be between the flywheel and the armatures of the coil right there, because there was some oil on the flywheel. So when that flywheel comes around, it's just touching those legs of the armature, and it might be just dragging on that, because everything in here looks good. The exhaust valve is stuck, so we'll have to get that freed up. The intake is still moving, so aside from that, I think we're going to be in good shape. So I'll get this all decarboned and cleaned up, and then we'll be ready to put the head back on. Alright folks, so I wanted to interject here while I'm cleaning up this engine. As you can see, I got the majority of the heavy carbon and everything off, but I still have to finish cleaning this and polish the mating face for the gasket here. And just as a side note, we are going to be going further in depth in a Briggs Model N engine. I have a coming video series. I did a repair and startup on a 1947 Planet Junior model PB1 walk-behind tractor. The engine needed an awful lot of work. So you guys will see more on valve trains for Briggs Model Ns and going through all this stuff, cleaning everything up in that video. But I want to keep this one at a reasonable length if possible. So we're just going to be zipping through this pretty quick. But I wanted to show you guys before I get everything cleaned up. The exhaust valve on here was stuck, and I got that freed up relatively easily. And you can see that there's still a lot of rust on the exhaust valve seat on the head. And then you can see the intake here is kind of shiny, but it does have a little bit of rust on it. But there was enough on the exhaust valve seat and the face of the exhaust valve too, which I did scrub up a little bit before I pulled that out, where I wanted to just take the valve train out of here and clean it up, because these only have a 2-inch bore on them, so you need every bit of compression that you can get out of these things. Alrighty, so the head of the engine is all cleaned up. As you can see, the valve train is back in it. So the valves did lap in pretty well. The exhaust valve had just a little tiny bit of pitting on the face, as did the intake valve, but it's a heck of a lot better than what it was when this first came out with all the rust that was built up on it. Cylinder, I scraped off the carbon from the top, so that cleaned up pretty well. And then of course the mating surface here for the gasket's all been cleaned down to the factory machining. And the head is all cleaned up, and that's all been decarboned, scrubbed that down with some brake cleaner and a wire brush. The bolts are all set, and the head gasket, we are going to be reusing the original head gasket that came out of this. Of course, if this was a customer's machine, it would be getting a new head gasket, but being that it's my own, and it's mostly going to be going to shows, and I'll play around with it some once spring and summer get here, cutting stuff, but it's not going to have a lot of hard use on it. So that used gasket is still in good shape, and that'll be good enough for what it is. So now we can go ahead and get the head torqued back down. So the head bolts on these Model Ns get torqued down to 140 inch-pounds. So I'm going to bring them down to about 70, and then I'll bring them down to the full 140 on the next round. And as you can see, I don't have the side shroud on the jug right here, the one that wraps around with the ID tag on it. I left that off because I'm going to run this through the parts washer after I do this and see if I can get some of this really goopy oil and everything that's on it off of it before we get into the ignition system. Engine cleaned up reasonably decent in the parts washer, so I got all the heavy stuff off for the most part. And what I'm going to do now is get this oil pan pulled off of here, because my intent was just to drain the oil out and get some new oil into it and then just run it. But when I went to drain it, this is what I ended up getting out of it. There was a little bit of water that came out at first, and then this really heavy oil, the really waxy stuff. It smells like wax. old oil, kind of like motor honey consistency, and that's probably why this thing's having some trouble turning over as it is, just because it's all caked in that really heavy stuff on the inside. And that could account, somebody might have put that in just because of the carbon buildup. This could be a smoker too, so who knows. But anyways, folks, what we're going to do is get this oil pan pulled off of here, get the interior of everything cleaned out, regasket it, and then get it back together again. So everything looks pretty clean inside, but there is sort of a waxy coating on everything because of the oil that was put into this thing. So that'll wash off there once this thing gets some fresh oil and kind of splashes and cleans everything up on the inside. And I am going to have to get a new base gasket cut for this, because I'm all out of new old stock ones. Oil pan is all cleaned up, new gasket's been cut, and I did pre-fill this with oil because some of you know that I've worked on these engines. Filling them through this little spring-loaded cap here does take a while, so in this case it's just easier to top off the oil pan before the engine goes back down onto it. Now, tightening down this other side here, as you guys saw when I had this engine first up here, we do have the fuel tank bracket that has to go on, so that is going to go back on there now, because we're pretty much done with everything on the engine, so it's not going to be in the way anymore. And that just sandwiches down on top of everything like so. So now it's time to move on to the ignition system. So we're going to get these points cleaned up, and as you guys can see, they are pretty well corroded. You can see all that white film on there. So we're going to run a little bit of 400 grit sandpaper between them and get everything cleaned up so we have a good contact surface again. Ignition system's all set. We have a nice hot spark. So I got the shroud and everything back onto the engine, so that's all ready to go. So now we have to get the fuel system cleaned up, and this is a pretty simple fuel system. This is the suction carburetor that Briggs & Stratton had back in the day, and I've actually never dealt with one of these before in all the years that I've been doing this. This is I think the second engine I've ever had here. The first one was a WMB, but I never ended up messing around with it. So we're going to get this cleaned up. I'm just going to run it through the parts washer. We're going to get all the jets and everything pulled out of it. I think it's going to be a pretty pretty straightforward cleanup because it's really not that much to it. And then the fuel tank here, we got to get the outside of that cleaned up, and inside is actually pretty darn clean. But what I am going to do is soak the end of this pickup tube in some acetone, because I did check this the other day and the check valve is working, but there's just a little bit of shellacked film on the screen on the bottom, which I do want to get off, and the acetone will melt that away. So we'll get both of these cleaned up and then we'll be ready to reassemble the fuel system. Alrighty, the fuel system's all cleaned up. So these carburetors are pretty simple, folks. These suction carburetors, Like I said, I've never worked on one before, but you really can't go wrong with them. So in the top here we had our main jet, which is this one right here, the adjustable main, and then of course the jet that sits down inside of it that you can unscrew. It's very much like the Pulsa-Jet carburetors, the tank mount Pulsa-Jets on the old lawnmower engines. Same style jet. And then the bottom here you have your fuel fitting that goes in right in this one right here, this port, and that just feeds up. You can see the line right here to the main jet to the top. So that's all cleaned up. Ran that through the parts washer. There wasn't any gook or anything like that inside of it, or shellac. So cleaned up nice, and it's ready for reassembly. I also got the fuel line cleaned up some and somewhat straightened out. When I get the carburetor and the tank mounted, I am going to rebend the curves here and here around a piece of pipe and see if I can make them a little bit more uniform, because this thing's been warped a couple times over the years from guys taking it on and off. Straightened out the air cleaner mount rod, or the air cleaner stud rather. That's all set. I dipped the pickup tube for the tank in some acetone, and I got what was left of the shellac off the screen. Granted, you guys probably won't be able to see it too well with the camera, but the check ball in here is working because this only allows the flow to go up. That way you don't lose prime and it drains back down into the tank. So luckily that's working. A lot of the times when I pull these things, they're so shellacked up, you got to cut the screen out and dig the ball out of there. So luckily that's all set. And of course the tank has got a small film inside of it, just a light yellow film from the old fuel over the years, but it's not something we're going to worry about because it didn't come off with the acetone, and I'm not going to bother bead blasting this one out. So anyways, that'll be all set. So now we can go ahead and reassemble our fuel system. Alrighty, so the engine's all back together. As you guys saw, I got the fuel line straightened out some. It's not a perfect curve on either side, but it sure as heck is a lot better than what it is. It kind of took the curse off of it. I also got the oil bath air cleaner back onto here, and I do have to look out for another oil bath for this thing at the shows this year, because this is a little bit newer than what it would have had for a period correct one. It's the same size, but the top portion right here, as you can see, this one is ribbed as it goes up to the top. So the original one would have had a one rib, and then it would have been a dome stamp across the top. So I got to look out for one of those, so that way I'll have the period correct oil bath on it. So our fuel system all mounted up back really nicely. Carburetor is on there and everything. I put the jug shroud back on earlier, so that's all set to go. And we do have good spark now too. So now it's time to get this thing out to the welding bench, get it clamped down, and fire it up. Well folks, we ended up with a nice running old Briggs & Stratton engine. So it does smoke a little bit. It started to smoke probably about 2 or 3 minutes after I fired it up. And of course, as soon as I shut the camera off, because I didn't think it was going to kick over, that's, that's when it kicked over. But aside from that, the thing runs great. It took a lot of priming to get this thing to kick over. So I think the check ball in the pickup line isn't sealing that well. I had to pressurize the fuel tank a couple of times, and then it finally started pulling in fuel and it lit off. So I let it run for a while, got it all adjusted in, and it's a very nice running engine despite the smoke, but we can still run it. It's not too bad. So now that that's all set, we can start tearing into the frame and the drivetrain and getting this all squared away. So because of the weight distribution of this thing, it has all these handles sticking up on the back here, and I have to pull the sickle bar off, obviously, because I won't be running that attachment. So what I'm going to do is start disassembling this from the back forward. I'm going to take the weight off of the back here. I got to get this handlebar separated from this pipe, and then of course this pipe separated from the pivot point and all that stuff. Get this broken down, and then I can go ahead and start breaking down the drivetrain and everything else, because some of that's going to have to get pulled apart, and I'm going to have to repack those gearboxes with grease, make sure those are all set, and we have to do some bushing work on the drive wheel here as well. So I wanted to show you guys this. When I first picked it up, I noticed this play in the axle, and you can see how severely worn that brass bushing is right there, where it goes through that tube for the axle. And then of course on the other side here, it's the same thing. We have the brass bushing. It's actually chewed out from the woodruff key knocking into it over the years, because this here is the axle right here. And as you can see, there's 2 set screws on the wheel that hold it onto here, and you can see that they do back off over time. It's probably not the best design in the world, and then you have a woodruff key cut right there. So when those set screws back off and then this axle slides this way, the edge of that woodruff key is going to chew right into the bushing and then right into this axle tube right there. So I got to get those knocked out of there and see if I can get some new bushings for them. We also have the little gearbox with the jack shaft, and that spins over pretty well actually. I was thinking about pulling it apart and re-greasing everything, but it does have a fitting on the back of it, and I think I'm just going to pump some grease into there, and that'll be good because everything's still tight. There's not a lot of play in it, and it spins over very smooth. So frame and everything's got to get washed off, and the parts cleaner, that's all got to get taken care of. This here is the wheel for it, and the hub is still in good shape despite what the axle looks like. There's a little bit of wear in that key cut in there, but it's nothing that's going to keep us from doing what we got to do. And then of course the handlebars, those all have to get freed up, because these are the twist handlebars up top. So if you twist this one, this is going to be your throttle, and then this is your drive system. you pull that lever back like so out of the notch, you twist it back, and the lever falls into another notch back here, and then that engages your wheel drive. So I know this one does not turn, this one does. Those have to get freed up, and then all the pivot points on this other arm have to get freed up. So now, folks, we just got the long process of getting everything cleaned up, rebushed, rebuilt, and then slowly reassembled again. So everything cleaned up in the parts washer pretty darn well. I got a lot of the heavy grease and junk off of everything that was built up. Sprockets all cleaned up. I got the chain all degreased, and of course the frame itself is all cleaned up as well. So I went ahead and I knocked out those bad bushings that were where the axle goes through in the axle tube. And luckily enough, I did find 2 of them in stock here. They're 1 inch long by 1 inch OD, and they have a 3/4 ID to them. So I can get those pressed in there, and then the frame will be all set to go back together. And I also went ahead and pulled apart the drive system too, which I wasn't going to pull this apart, but there was a little bit of play, I guess a significant amount, in this piece right here, where this shaft goes through, and this shaft takes this aluminum pulley right here, and that drives directly off of the engine for the ground drive. So I figured if I'm this far into it, I might as well replace them. And this has, if I pull that out, you can see there is a brass bushing in there with a flange on it. So it has one there, and then there was one pressed into the outside case here. So these are pretty standard sizes. It's a 1/2 inch ID and a 5/8 OD, and then it has a flange on it that's a 1/16 of an inch thick. So those are a standard size flange bushing. I was able to get 2 of those, so those are on order. And then there's also one on the back side of here, another brass bushing, and I have to see about figuring out what size that is too, because I figured while I'm in here I'll do that one as well. I was just going to do the one for the input shaft, but then the drive system will be nice and shored up, and I won't have any loose play or anything like that. Alrighty, folks, so the main drive gearbox is all cleaned up. As you can see, everything's been degreased and the bushings have been knocked out of it. So I have new bushings coming for that hole and that one for the shaft that goes in from the engine, the input shaft. And then I have new bushings going into here too for the jack shaft that drives over to the chain, which drives it down to the axle. So those will be in hopefully at the end of the week, and then we can get that back together. But for the time being, we're going to start reassembling the frame here. So the first thing that I'm going to do before I drive both of those bushings in right there to this axle tube is where you can see here where the Woodruff key kind of chewed out the side of this pipe from when the wheel got loose. We're going to fill that in with some weld, and then we can grind everything smooth so it's a uniform surface again. Not like it's going to make too much of a lick of a difference, but I figured since it's down this far, we might as well get it right. Axle bushings have been installed and everything's snugged up real nice on the axle. So I wanted to show you guys this. This is how much use this thing got over the years, and working on it, and I'm really realizing how worn out and how much somebody actually got their money's worth out of this thing. If you can see it, just behind this gear, if you look between the gear and this welded bushing inside the arm, you can see about an 1/8 inch gap, give or take. And you can see the bushing sticking out right there. So that was from this gear wearing into this metal bushing, the sleeve where the brass bushing presses into, because these bushings are 1 inch long and they're machined from the factory with lands on the inside that they press up against, and of course this side is still flush. But that's how far the backside wore down from this gear just pushing into it. So like I said, somebody really got their money's worth out of this machine over the years. So before I put the wheel back on, now that the axle is on there, I wanted to break it down and get everything cleaned up. So as you can see, this is a split rim wheel. It's very much like the Gravely rims, and I can't remember if Firestone made these back in the days or if these were specific to manufacturers that put them on their equipment like Gravely or Bolens. I think somebody was stamping these out. So all I did was just wire wheel all the crust and the rust and everything off the back side of them, and then I wiped them down with a really oily rag just to help keep the rust from coming back in case any moisture gets into there. the hub in the center I had ground out. It was mushroomed over from somebody hitting it back onto the axle over the years. So I ground that off and smoothed everything up. I also ran a tap through those holes, and instead of the Allen head set screws, I ended up finding some of these with the square heads on the top of them. That way I can sock them down nice and tight, because this thing seems to be notorious for loosening up given what that axle looks like. Tire is still in good shape, and we also have a brand new tube to go back into it, so we're all set. So before this wheel goes back on, because this Woodruff key cut is so close to this bushing, and I don't want it chewing into here like it did before if this wheel gets loose. So what I did is I went and found a small, I guess you could say it's a thrust washer. I used to pull these off a lot of the Craftsman lawn tractors back in the day when we'd part them out here. And a lot of them were on the front axles on the spindles. And they work out as pretty good spacers for things with a 3/4 inch shaft, because that's what the idea is, of course. So I'm just going to put this on here, and there's just enough room between the Woodruff key cut when the Woodruff key goes in and this washer to put the Woodruff key in it, not have it drag around on it. So that way if it gets loose for some reason when I'm using it and I don't catch it, when this shaft moves backwards, it'll dig this key into this washer instead of digging that key into this bushing stock right here. And then with these set screws on here with the square heads, I can sock it down a lot tighter than what it would be with the Allen head set screws. And it'll be easier to tighten up too in due time. Well folks, I made an unfortunate discovery on the back of this engine. As you can see in the middle of the picture frame right there, there's a horizontal crack going across the block, and it is right here going across the back side of it, which I just noticed it when I was putting this engine on here, and it's been doing this for a while. It's been leaking because there was a wet spot right there, and as you can see there's a really nice patch of paint. And even this engine plate that it mounts to is also really caked in oil before I washed it off, so it kind of makes sense that it's been leaking. Unfortunately, it's sort of too late for me to pull this thing down and braze it. As much as I'd like to, it's going to add another half a day to a day's worth of work to this thing, and it's not going to, this crack isn't going to affect anything structurally in this block. So what I'm going to end up doing is just doing the JB Weld thing and putting a nice neat little bead over this to stop the flow of oil. I know it's not going to really help the crack structurally, but I do want to stop the oil from going all over this thing. So unfortunately that's the case, but it's not the end of the world, so we can get it taken care of. So in the meantime, while we're waiting for bushings for the drive system, we might as well get this reel mower all squared away. So this is the 22-inch reel mower attachment for this Handi-Ho. As you can see here, I just have it loosely fitted to the machine. That way you guys can kind of see what everything looks like, and it also gives me a chance to see how everything mounts and what's going to have to get fixed on it. So I know this thing does spin over, but it's got a lot of stuff that needs to get addressed on it. You can see somebody used some nails for pins on the front casters, and I know the reel does move, but it's really stiff. That's going to have to get freed up. We might have to delve into this gearbox too here on the side. So I went ahead and got the reel mower all disassembled, and everything came apart fairly nice. The bed knife was a little bit stuck in where these dowel pins go into the end plates, but aside from that, everything disassembled well. So I went ahead and took some tool steel and cleaned off the rust on the edge of this bed knife right here, and you guys really won't be able to see it much on camera, but it is still a nice shearing surface. There's little nicks and marks where stuff was dragged through, but it's not going to affect the cutting. And the same thing with the reels right here. I ran a file very easily just to get the rust off of this knife edge here, and there's really not any heavy pitting on it, and you can still just barely catch your skin on a knife edge. It's not sharp, but it'll be enough to cut grass. So I'll get that cleaned up a little bit. I do have to oil these bearings on the end. They're the original bearings and they still move well. They're not gritty, but I want to get some more oil into them. And as for the shroud, I am going to wire wheel the underside of this. It's pretty rusty just from, I'm assuming, old grass sitting over there, under there, over the years, and ends up rusting the paint off. So I'll get that cleaned up so we can get that oiled, and I'll also wire wheel the bed knife as well. This little gearbox is going to have to come apart, so I'll show you guys when it comes time to disassemble that, because it's just very stiff in this pivot, and I want to make sure this is all cleaned out and has good grease in it for when this goes back together. But aside from that, everything looks to be in good shape. So we'll start with the process of getting everything cleaned up. Well, I didn't plan on wire wheeling the reel for this mower up, but as you guys can see, there is a lot of green paint left underneath all that rust. So it's just a surface rust that formed over everything, and as you can see right there where I wire brushed everything, it's all coming back. So I'm just kind of taking my time going through it, and once I get all that stuff scrubbed off of there, I'll wipe it down with a nice oily rag, and it should bring that green back to it quite nicely. With the exception of the drive gearbox, I got everything cleaned up and I'm starting to reassemble the reel mower. So as you guys can see, I have everything wiped down with a light coat of oil just for the time being. I got a couple more months until the grass starts to grow, so I want to make sure this thing doesn't flash rust in the time being while it's in storage. So I wanted to show you the bed knife on this thing. As you can see, first, the reel mower, or the reel itself, is spinning over very nicely. I did get some oil into those bearings. So it's kind of a neat adjustment on here, and it's very simple. It has an eccentric nut on the back side of it, or eccentric nut on the side of the reel mower, and then there is an oblong hole in this side plate right here. So all you have to do is you twist this one way or another. So if I go backwards with it, that brings the bed knife down, and then forwards just brings the bed knife up. So I got to play around with that and see if I can get the thing to work, at least good enough to cut grass. It would really be nice to set this up onto a reel sharpener, because it really does need a good sharpening, but for the time being, we'll see if we can get it to cut good enough to play around with it come springtime. Alrighty, so I wanted to show you guys this. I seem to have gotten this bed knife as close as I can get it, and it's hitting mostly on either side, but it's kind of missing in the middle. So it might have a little bit of a warp to it, and like I said, the thing could really use a good sharpening, both the reel and the bed knife, and get everything trued up again. But for what we're using it for, I'm just going to get it as close as I can. So I'm by no means an expert on reel mowers. I just kind of fly by the seat of my pants over the years on these. I haven't really had a good chance to learn and educate myself on how these things are properly set and sharpened and all that stuff. And we did know the mechanic at the golf course in town here, and he used to do these things. He was a mechanic there for about 15 or 20 years. Really good guy. And when I went up there once to talk to him, he showed me some reels that he sharpened, and he had a post-it note in his hand, and they weren't hitting like these are. You see how I have it so the bed knife is hitting the reels? So he had it so it was just barely enough clearance in between it. And he spun that thing over with that post-it note, and it just lunched the entire post-it note. Really nice shearing. It just cut it very, very well. So as you can see, this will not be shearing like the post-it note. We kind of cut there. It sort of drags it through in the middle. and then as it gets over to this side, it actually starts to cut the paper again. So unfortunately, that's what we have to work with. And someday, once I get a bigger place, it really would be nice not only to have a bridge port and a lathe, but also to have a reel sharpener too, to be able to do all these antique reel mowers, both the push mowers and the attachments for the old garden tractors. So that's that, folks. Now I can finish getting this thing back together. Alrighty, folks, this is the last thing we have to do is go through this drive gearbox for the reel mower, and then we can get it mounted back up on the machine. It's actually got a brass bushing inside of it. I thought it was just a piece of tube, and there wasn't anything but that tube in there, and the aluminum casting ran inside of it. Which I don't know if you guys can see this on camera. Well, you might be able to. That this piece is actually tapered. You can see it's smaller on this end than it is up here. Oh, that was bone dry. That needed some oil. Holy crap. That's a good thing we opened this one up. And this does not have a grease fitting. Well, okay, it's got a grease fitting for this shaft where it runs through down below, where that odd spot is where I said it was tapered, but it does not have one like the other gearbox does on the tractor in order to grease all this up. So that's going to have to get packed with grease when this goes back together. Gearbox has all been cleaned up and it's all ready for reassembly. So I got what little grease was in here all washed out, so that's all been ran through the parts washer as usual. So that's ready to get packed with grease upon reassembly. I also have a new case gasket cut for it. And these cases don't fit together. They fit together well, but they don't mate up very well. It touches on the side, and then on the bottoms here and on the top it has a little bit of a space. So we are going to have to put just a bit of RTV in there to take up the gap when it goes back together. Now the tricky part about this is I have to fill in as much of this gearbox as I can with grease without getting too much on here. Of course I can always clean it off because we do still have to RTV that. But since there's no grease fitting in here, we got to get as much as we possibly can into this gearbox before it goes back together. So I have a layer of RTV on here, and it's a lot heavier than what I was going to put on, but I'd rather have it squish and fill in the gaps when this case closes up, and then once it dries I can peel off the excess. So I'll put the gasket here in the middle, and then we can get both of these halves set together. And I just have to be careful not to turn the shafts, that way this grease doesn't get pushed around. Unfortunately, these alignment holes are just a little bit off on the gasket. It's a little bit closer on that side. Reel mower gearbox is all sealed up and back together. So as you can see, there's a bunch of RTV and everything that's squished out the side. So what I'm going to do is let this sit on the bench for a while, and then once everything dries up, I can peel that right off of there, and it'll be nice and neat, and there won't be really any or very little remnants of that RTV. So that'll clean up nicely. And I also took and I put some GB weld on the back side of this block the other day. So I laid down a couple pieces of tape just to get a nice strip of JB, and that adhered nicely to the block, so now we won't have that oil leak coming out when this thing is running anymore. So while the RTV is still drying on the reel mower gearbox, I started reassembling the handlebars here, and as you guys can see, I have the lower section pipe that's all fitted up. Everything's been cleaned up and greased. I also have the adjuster bar that's all been greased up as well too. And right now I'm working on the throttle and the clutch levers, so the main T handlebar that goes up on the top of that. And the clutch on here was stuck, as I had mentioned in the beginning of the video. This wouldn't move, so luckily enough I got that freed up, and I can't pull this pipe off. I was hoping I'd be able to, but there's a locating pin underneath here, as you guys can see in that slot, and that pin goes into a blind hole, so there's no way for me to get it out unless I grind it off and then drill it out and then push another pin in there. But luckily I got it loosened up, and I blew a lot of the crust and crap out through the end. I pushed all that through, and the water and whatever else was left in there came out the end of that pipe. So that's all set. I do have to get the lever squared away for it. The end of it's just a little bit peened up, so I got to get that leveled back out. And it looks like somebody might have used spring steel from a set of ignition points for the return spring for this. Unless that's factory, which I kind of doubt. I thought it was kind of neat. A couple of pieces of stainless spring stock. And then the throttle over here, that's moving as it should be, but it didn't have a very good friction disc in here when it first came in, and it had a piece of like polyethylene or propylene, I can't remember which is which, the milk jug plastic, but it's very slippery. It's a hard plastic. So I have a box of rubber washers, so I stamped out the center of one of those to make it bigger, and then sliced it and then put it in between these two pieces of metal, so it provides a little bit more friction on this twist throttle right here, so that way when you pull it back, it's going to stay in position where it should be when the machine is running. Alright, so I'm bouncing around a little bit here, folks. As you can see, I got the handlebars back together, so those are all greased up and pivoting like they should. I also put the throttle cable on there as well, so that's all been installed. I haven't tied it up yet on this pipe because I have to put the PTO cable on, which mounts up right next to it here, so I want to tie both of them together on this pipe. So those are on there. The reel mower is all back together, as you can see. The gearbox is reinstalled, and everything moves very nicely now. Spins over well. I oiled up the chain, freed everything up, so everything's moving like it should. And you might be able to see it or have noticed that this gearbox is kind of funky with the way that the shaft comes out of it, because you can see the shaft is machined at an angle downwards, and then this snout right here is also at an angle, I think upwards if I'm not mistaken. And they did that so you could shim the gearbox, which in the instructions they have shims that were included, so you can put them under these bolts here to shim up the sprocket to tighten up the chain. So I think they did that to compensate for it, but unfortunately there's no way that I can change that. So hopefully the belt ride's okay once it's on the engine and everything is hooked up. Casters are all greased up and everything. I took those apart and cleaned them up. The only thing I might have to do is put a tighter tensioner spring on here, because it has the original one, which is a little bit weak, but it is doing what it should. So that's all set and ready to go back on. So what I'm going to do is get that mounted up first, and then I just went and picked up all of my parts for the drive gearbox too, so we can get that put back together as well. Bushings and the belt for the reel mower. Main drive gearbox is all ready for reassembly. So as you guys can see, I have a new gasket cut for this, and I don't think I'm going to RTV it as I did the reel mower gearbox, because when I put these halves together, they seem like they're fitting pretty well, and there's not much for a gap going around it. So I'm going to take a chance and put it together with just the gasket, and then see how everything goes. Hopefully we won't have grease pushing out everywhere, but we'll find out in due time. And then I have the new bushings for this as well. So I have new main shaft bushings, and this is for this shaft right here, which drives over to the sprocket and the chain that goes down to the wheel. So those will press into there, and you can see there's a machine land down the bottom. So these have a 3/4 ID, 1-inch OD, and they're only 7/8 long, unlike the 1-inch long ones that we used on the axle. So I had to order those, and then I also got these flanged bushings right here, and these are going to push into these holes right here. They'll press into those, and then we have a Welch plug right here, which is going to end up going into the back side of this one right there, so that way it doesn't push grease out the back side. So anyways, we got all our parts together, so now we can go ahead and start with reassembly. And just like the reel mower gearbox, we're going to get a bunch of grease pumped into this thing before it goes back together. So I just put a little bit of RTV on here, that way it'll help this gasket stay in place and hopefully won't let it push over into any of the grease when I put the top of the case back on. Main drive gearbox is all set. So as you can see, I got everything reassembled along with the idler pulley on there. So this spins over quite nicely now. Everything's all loaded up with grease and rebushed. So I ended up shooting some more grease into the grease fitting on the back of here along with this cross tube right here. So that's all loaded up as well. So now we're ready to put this back onto the tractor. Alright folks, so we're in good shape. So with the exception of putting the chain guard back on here, just because I want to show you guys what everything looks like, and finding a longer belt for the reel mower, everything is all set and ready to fire up. So the reel mower here, as you can see, I have the belt on it. This is the factory size belt, 17 inches. So I'm going to have to pick up one that's 18, because as you can see, to engage this reel mower, you flip the gearbox backwards, and then this spring pulls it, and it kind of cams over on itself and makes tension like so. But it's just barely to the point of wanting to start to cam backwards, so it's going to need a little bit longer of a belt to allow it to pull down under it and then start to put tension on that belt. So everything else is on here for the drive gearbox and everything. That all mounted up nicely. I do have the drive belt back on there along with the belt guard and another spring compared to what it had. This one's got a little bit more tension, and we're going to have to see how that does. Might have to put a tighter one on there. So I put a new drive system cable and casing on here. I used the original throttle cable and casing, and as you can see, I also have the kill switch wire on there. And at some point I'd like to find some period correct clips, but for the time being we do have zip ties on there. So those run up the handlebars, and everything's been hooked up top. So the engagement lever for the drive that I had apart earlier, that flips backwards, and then the handle locks in, and then you pull the lever, and then that engages your wheel drive. So down here it would look like so, and then you flip the lever and it engages. So it's a pretty simple system. On the other side here, I got a brand new drive chain on here. After everything's been rebushed now with the axle and this drive gearbox, there wasn't as much slack in the system. So somebody had cut the other chain and pinned it in kind of a strange way without using a master link. So I wasn't able to make it work, but I did have this new chain in stock. So that's been all cut to size and tensioned properly. So now our drive system is all squared away. Well folks, the Handi-Ho is all back together and up and running. So I waited a little bit to upload this video, that way I could let the grass green up here in the springtime. And I was able to do a little bit of mowing with this, and it actually cuts surprisingly well given the condition of those reels. It's a little bit sharper than what I figured once it gets going, and it leaves a pretty decent cut. There's some stuff sticking up, but it's really not too overly bad. So I have to finish up a couple of things on here. The main one is just gluing on these hand grips because they're still loose. So you can't, especially the clutch arm here, you have to grab it up here to be able to pull the lever and then twist it, because the grip always wants to twist on you. So I have to get some glue on there. The engine does run very nice. It does smoke some. It's worn out, as you'd expect from a machine out of the 40s. But it's a good runner, and everything seems to work well when it's mowing. So in due time, I'd like to get the sickle bar cleaned up for this and have that as an attachment that I can put on it for the shows as well. But anyways folks, there you have it. That's going to be all for the repair and the startup of the Bolens Handi-Ho, and now we can head over into the grass and do a little bit of mowing with it.